Hello, welcome to the first webinar in the Innovation for Localisation series. Great to have you all with us. My name is Sarah Stevens and I work with innovation at Save the Children Denmark. Before we get started, just to make some housekeeping announcements and just to give you a bit of an orientation to this live event that you're attending. So the event will be recorded. A recording of this session will be available through the attendee link that you've just joined. So this will be available once this event comes to an end. So on the right-hand side of your screen, hopefully you should be able to see a live event Q&A section. If you haven't done so already, it would be great if you could press the Ask a Question button and enter your name, position and organisation, just for us to get an idea of who we have in the room and who's attending. The live Q&A function will be available throughout this webinar, so please do not hesitate to press that Ask a Question button and type in your question, and if relevant, adding in who the question is directed to. So throughout the webinar, you'll be able to see the questions that have been posed by other attendees. You can select which view you would like and whether you'd like to see the most liked questions or the most recent questions. And we'll endeavour to try to allow as much time as possible at the end of this session for questions. So please help us to prioritise the questions that you have by voting for the questions that you're particularly interested in hearing answers to. And you can do this by clicking the thumbs up icon next to the question. So the speakers themselves will be presenting in English today, but we have tried to make this webinar as inclusive as possible. So there is subtitling and captioning function available. So to access this, just move your cursor to the bottom of the screen and press what looks like a CC box at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And this, by clicking this, should turn on the subtitling function. So the subtitles are available in 5 different languages. So to select your language of subtitles, just click the wheel next to the CC button to set your subtitling language. So once again, thank you so much for attending today. It's great to see so many of you joining us. We're over 100 attendees already, so great to have you with us, and please keep adding in where you're from and which organisation you're part of, just again so that we can get a flavour of who's in the room. So as I mentioned, my name's Sarah Stevens and I work with innovation at Save the Children Denmark. I'll be moderating this webinar alongside a fantastic lineup of speakers that we have with us today. So today is the first webinar in our series of Innovation for Localisation events. These are showcasing the various initiatives using innovation as an approach to further the localisation agenda. Today's webinar will be focused on sharing the findings and recommendations of a research report entitled Exploring the Impact of Channeling Unrestricted Funding to NNGOs in Emergency Contexts. So this particular research project drew inspiration from one of the most widely recognised innovations in humanitarian assistance. Just going to reach for my water. One of the most widely recognised innovations, cash. The research project itself was set up to test the hypothesis that channeling unrestricted funding directly to local partners would promote agency of local partners, recognise their capacity to make their own choices, promote their own institutions' needs, and ultimately result in the provision of better humanitarian assistance. So, to the best of our knowledge, at the time this TOR was drafted for this project, the project was the first to pilot this type of approach, which goes beyond pooled funding and transfers unearmarked, unrestricted institutional funding directly to local partners. So this research report, commissioned by Save the Children Denmark with funds from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, using innovation funding, particularly ring-fenced for innovation, with an encouragement to invest in knowledge products, initiatives, approaches to be bold, take risks, and push boundaries of our work with children. So thank you to Danita for the encouragement to use funds in this way. And apologies, my voice is completely going. So as my voice is failing me for some reason, I'm going to try and introduce you to the speakers who hopefully will not have lost their voices for this session. I'd like to firstly introduce Evelyn Noijang from the Bumbawe Women's Development Association from Cameroon. Evelyn, it'd be great if you could just give us a wave to the camera. Great to have you with us. We also have other partners on the line. Unfortunately, we've not been able to get them on the actual video recording of this event, but we will be hearing from them via voice message. I'll also like to introduce you to Ben Munson, who is the project lead for this research project. Ben, if you could also just give us a wave. The project itself has been a fantastic collaboration between Street Child and Save the Children Denmark. So Ben will be talking us through an overview of the project and the key findings and analysis. So this research report, exploring the impact of channeling unrestricted funding to national and local organisations in emergency contexts, set out to achieve three aims. One, to improve our knowledge and understanding of local partners and how they spend institutional funding. To explore ways in which institutional funding influence access to further funding through other means. And then to draw on these findings to generate recommendations, institutional funding to local partners, and share these fundings as widely as possible. So to help us set the scene for this, I'd like to hand over now to our localisation advisor at Save the Children Denmark, Lillian Ambasser, just to give us a brief situational overview of why this project is so important. So Lillian, I hope your voice is much stronger than mine, and over to you.
So let's hope. Hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So yes, just a few words, I think, on maybe why we felt this research was important. And of course, it is important not to, to really leave the time and the space to the actual, our partners or the actual organizations who implemented projects in the field and that, are in the position to tell us exactly how they use the funds and why. I think on this call, probably most, if not all, in the call are aware of the grand bargain and of the target of 25% being of funding, humanitarian funding, being channeled directly or as directly as possible to local organizations. And we are probably all aware of kind of the collective failure, or at least maybe the failure of the international community to reach that target. So speaking about localization, I think it is as much about quantity of funding than the quality of funding. And we've seen already with figures about funds being directly channeled to local actors reaching like 3% in kind of optimistic estimates, to maybe a bit over 10% when you count the intermediaries, funds that are passing through one intermediary. Yeah, so the quantity is already, we're not there. But when it comes to the quality of funds, I think local actors, local national actors are really highlighting the fact that it's really difficult for them to get access to this funding, quality funding. By quality, that might be multi-year funding, but it's mainly flexible funding and then unrestricted funding being passed directly. And of course, this is in order to have greater efficiency gains for children, for communities, for the organizations around, and ultimately for everyone. So local and national actors we've been discussing with, they all reported how hard it was for them to get access to direct funds. And then accessing flexible and unrestricted funding, and therefore be able to invest in their capacity development, organizational sustainability, and be able to respond to humanitarian responses, to humanitarian crises, all being affected. While I think very few donors would call into question the 7%, at times 10% unrestricted funding or administrative costs that NNGOs, international NGOs and UN agencies, for instance, can have. And these funds that allow organizations to be sustainable, to invest, to be also autonomous. So while international actors have access to it, and it's, this is probably a hard-fought gain, but it's there. It's not the situation, it's not the same case for local national NGOs or organizations. So there is kind of strong inequity in there. Well, while we are speaking about the same thing, because they don't have access to these funds, so what local actors or national actors report is their inability to retain staff, their inability to invest in capacity strengthening, just the inability to just become stronger organizations. Very much at the heart of this is the lack of trust. And I think the common refrain that a lot of us, I would say, even have been saying is, will local or national actors be able to spend the funds responsibly? So at the time of this research, so it was in 2019 when it was commissioned, there was very limited research and evidence as to what would local actors do with funds if they were given access to unrestricted funding. So the project aimed to increase the knowledge and the evidence-based research in order to challenge the risk narrative and to be able to advocate for more flexible and restricted funds to be available to local partners. So Sarah mentioned, that the whole idea also came, and inspiration came from cash-based assistance. So while a few years ago, it was considered very risky to give, cash directly to local actors because, maybe national organizations felt that they were better, able to be the one to decide what was good and best for organizations in the field or for the people that were receiving assistance. I think now we are in a state a few years later where I think it's not anymore, the question is no longer whether the flexible modality is appropriate, but it's really rather how to best use it in disaster response. So we really hope, that's just a piece of research, but hopefully which is adding, and together with others, we really hope that this will help. It would be the same, with the cash-based assistance. That finally, being using unrestricted funding will no longer be an exception. but that it will lead all of us, donors, intermediaries, NNGOs, maybe to trust local organizations, national organizations more, and to be really able to take a few risks if this is what this is about, and maybe also have less rigid requirements, because while we tend to say it's all about donors being very rigid, as NNGOs, we also have a part to play in there, because sometimes we come up with even more stringent requirements for partners or local organizations. So stopping here, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Great to have that contextual background to start this event. Unfortunately, Lillian won't be able to stay with us for the whole event, but if you do have specific questions for her, please do not hesitate to put them into the Q&A over the next few minutes, and we'll try and answer as many of those in the chat as possible. So I'll now hand over to Ben Munson, the Global Partnership Advisor and Project Coordinator Lead from Street Child, to take us through an overview of the research project and study itself, the approach, and also the methodology used. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and also thank you, Lillian, for, I think, putting the research piece in the general context of the work that's been done globally on moving local organisations forward and their representation in this system that we work in. So also thank you very much for everyone attending today. I see there's a high number of people joining this webinar. I think this really highlights the focus that people have put on this agenda and the work that needs to be done to move this forward in the future. So thank you for joining. Also, while I get my thanks out of the way, thank you to Save the Children and Anita for the collaboration during this project. It's been great to work so collaboratively with both Save the Children and also the partners that we've been working with on the ground and getting their feedback. So I'm very much looking forward to the feedback from the local organisations that were really a mainstay in this project during this next hour. As said, the project took place last year, and it involved 6 different countries, as can be seen on the screen: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Cameroon, the DRC, Mozambique, and Nigeria. These are countries where Street Child already had an existing presence and were already operating in a humanitarian context in these situations. In terms of the outputs of this research project, as Sarah kind of briefly highlighted at the start, there were 3 main objectives of this research project. Number 1 was to improve knowledge and research into how local organisations chose to spend unrestricted funding. On top of that, it was the mechanisms they chose and decided how they spent that funding. Additionally, it was to see how unrestricted funding could lead to further funding opportunities for local organisations. And then finally, which is kind of one of the main reasons we're doing this session today, is to share some of those learnings and recommendations to the wider community to basically improve the way that our humanitarian system works and funding flows down to local organisations in the most efficient and successful way. So how this worked was that we had a tranche of funding. So we had about $15,000 available for each of the countries to work in. And we decided to, from this, do a 3-month project. Obviously, there was prep either side of that, but the bulk of the project was across 3 months, starting in March last year. And as you all can probably remember, that is just around the time that COVID-19 was taking off around the world in a big way. So this is hugely reflected in the way that this project was run, but also I think that will come out later in some of the reflections from local organisations and from the analysis of the project. So we had $15,000 to provide unrestricted funding to local organisations in each of these 6 countries. And how did we do that? We wanted to try and break down the historic and existing barriers that exist in the humanitarian sector, mainly for local partners. They exist across the board, but these are historically much more a barrier for local organisations. And these are kind of historic funding requirements, a due diligence process, and also visibility in the humanitarian context. So to do so, we want to design a selection criteria which match this kind of want to make it as accessible as possible for local organisations. So to do so, we wanted to limit it to only local organisations that could apply, because we know that international organisations do get the bulk of funding in humanitarian contexts. And there were 4 key selection criteria that came through this process that we felt would enable local organisations to have the best chance to, see this opportunity, apply for this opportunity. And again, as you can see, it's only available for local organisations, but to get the most, applications in. So in terms of the selection process, they had to be a local organisation or a national organisation that had implemented education activities at some point in the last 5 years. And the way that this was confirmed was through the education in emergencies sector, that they had submitted some kind of data in the last 5 years to the sector. And the reason we added in this criteria was because we realised that we had the biggest knowledge in these contexts of the education sector, and also we felt that we couldn't have this as broad as every single sector. So we wanted to try and understand how like-minded organisations in different contexts would use unrestricted funding. So that's why we kept this variable constant across the 6 countries. Additionally, it's worth noting that we only selected 1 organisation in each country, and therefore trying to keep some level of standardisation across the 6 countries was also important. Additionally, we wanted to keep the annual budget of the organisations that qualified between $150,000 a year and $4 million. You might ask kind of why we kept these limits. The top limit was to avoid any kind of local organisations or national organisations that almost acted as an INGO, so they were, had huge scale projects, and we also wanted to make sure that the $15,000 we gave them was, it had an impact on their way of working. It wasn't so small in their annual budget that it wouldn't have an impact. Additionally, we felt in this project that because we wanted to do a light touch due diligence, we wanted an organisation with over $150,000 per year of income, because we felt that they would have a set of structures in place to be able to deal with, income of 10% of their annual expenditure. We'll talk again a bit later about what this meant and what was the outcome of having this in place. Finally, we didn't want to influence the local partner and how they spent money, so we agreed with SAVE that we wouldn't have an organisation that had previously had a relationship, either funding or a capacity development relationship with Save the Children or Street Child. And then finally, there are some occasions when a national NGO is effectively a branch of an INGO, and we also excluded those. So across the 6 countries, we had 258 organisations apply for this fund, but only 91 of these fit the requirements for these selection. So this kind of shows that there's a huge need for this funding and unrestricted funding in these contexts, and I think that kind of highlighted the fact that we need to ensure that the flow of unrestricted funding continues towards these humanitarian contexts. So I think that's probably where I'll start. And then the only thing I'll say now is that the project was 3 months, and the organisations had to submit an indicative budget before the money was transferred. But in terms of what the funding can be spent on, there was no limits of what it could be spent on, so it was completely unrestricted. And we tried to reiterate that throughout the whole planning process of the local organisation. And then the final part is that after the 3-month project, Street Child would go and have interviews with each of the 6 organisations to understand how they spent their money and why they spent it that way. So that's the kind of overview of the project as such.
Thanks so much, Ben. And yeah, great to hear the overview of the project, and as Ben mentioned, just to reiterate, one of the key objectives of doing today's webinar really is to try to share the lessons learnt and the way that this study was set up, so that the recommendations, findings, and methodology can be built upon and help to increase the evidence base in this area. So as Ben mentioned before, we move on to the key findings and recommendations. We really want to give as much of the word to the participating organisations in this project, to hear their reflections and their experience of being involved in this study, but most importantly in receiving the unrestricted funding that they had access to through this project. As I mentioned at the start, we have had a few technical difficulties today, but I'm very, very pleased to say that that we have managed to get Evelyn to join us from the Mbonwe Women's Development Association in Cameroon. So fantastic to see you here, Evelyn, and really looking forward to hearing your reflections on being involved in this study, and interested really to hear what was the most interesting thing that you learned or benefited from being involved in this project, and maybe also to reflect upon any advice that you would give to donors or other international NGOs who are attending this call and looking to find ways of providing more unrestricted funding to organisations like yours. So great to hand over the word to you, Evelyn, and thank you so much. Can you hear us, Evelyn?
No, when this is, there you go, they can hear you now.
There we go. Hi, Evelyn, can you hear us?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Can you hear me?
We can. Over to you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, meeting everyone. As concerns the project, first of all, in a crisis situation or an emergency situation, NGOs on the ground often have a lot of needs, a lot of projects. That's to say that, for example, a community like our country at the moment, there are lots and lots of needs. So to get present a need to an organization like Street Child and get an unrestricted funding is very, very helpful. First of all, when you are in a crisis situation, there are things that change very fast. I will use the example of our project in Cameroon. When we presented the project and it was accepted, COVID-19 came in, which was very strong. So the timing was had to be shifted. Like we had to start in May, we now had to start in June. And we had to do a lot of things which were not really planned before the starting of the project, which had to make the project to succeed. We had to also deal with the COVID-19 on top of the project. We had to do child protection inside the project, which we felt that this funding was very good because it helped us to do a lot of, to make the project possible without actually having a problem with the funder. And it worked very well. So the fact that the funding was unrestricted, it helped us to be flexible and to take care of everything, a lot of things that were surrounding the success, the impact, getting the right impact that we needed. For example, also, we instead of just using 3 months, we were able to use 4 months to make because it was a vocational training. We saw that for us to accomplish the program excellently and actually set a base for these young people who were on the street, who had been affected by war, who were under trauma, who were not having this. So we had to do a lot of things within this period, and it was accepted by the project, which was very good for us. So we think that the unrestricted funding helps a lot to enable the organization to be flexible and to succeed and to make impact in the project. But one thing that we also learned about it was also that, you know, just as I've said, a lot of things could come in within the project period, which you need to handle. And because it was unrestricted, it was possible for us to handle that. And then another aspect of it was that we were able to work with the funders because we were in close contact with the funders, and we were actually showing them what the ground is like and what are the bits of changes that we are making in the program, and they were able to understand. So it was very good for us. What we learned also there was that most of the time in a crisis situation, you cannot really make a project so strict. It cannot be so strict because you wake up in the morning and there can be something that needs to be changed, need to be added. Some children that they were not planned to be taken from their homes, but because of the crisis situation, you have to spend more to pick them up from their homes to the training center and take them back. So we are actually saying that the nature of the funding, which was unrestricted, helped to make impact, that the project was could be well accomplished and could make impact. But we also want to talk to our funders that in crisis, emergency situations, there are so many needs. These NGOs have a lot of needs. Some of them might not be able to meet the questions on being able to provide, let me say that, they said the funding should be like 1/10 of your year's budget. In the years that are good, in the times that are good times when things are running well, most of the NGOs could be able to meet that condition. But in a crisis situation, sometimes it is difficult for them to meet that condition. And then we also think that the NGOs should, this Street Child and Save the Child Denmark should think about repeating a funding so as to make greater impact, especially in the emergency and crisis situation. If it's just one time, yes, it is good, but we think that it would be better if it is 2 times, for example. It will help the NGO to achieve more. I will use our situation in context. If we have trained 200 children this year, and we are able to train 300 next year, we have accomplished 500 within a crisis period. So if they were to look at the work of the NGO, look at the way the project was executed, and maybe repeat the funding or extend the funding to another period, it will help a lot in the accomplishment of a greater impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, for those reflections and for that call to action as well for all the INGOs and donors listening to this call, for it not to be a one-time only opportunity, and hopefully that's what we'll be able to generate through sharing the learnings from this first piece of research. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to hand over to Imtiaz, if you can hear me. As I mentioned, we have had a few technical difficulties, but Imtiaz is one of the street child coordinators based in Bangladesh and has been working closely with the participating partner in Bangladesh, Samjad Kayan O Yanya Sangsa, SKUS, and Jasmine Prema, I know, is listening to this call, the CEO of SKUS, but unfortunately we've not been able to actually get Jasmine on video to share reflections to us directly, but I'm hoping, Imtiaz, through the powers of WhatsApp or audio calls, you've been able to get Jasmine's contribution. So over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah, for giving me the opportunity. And yes, from SQS side, we have received some recordings from their overview. So yeah, I'm playing that. So yeah.
This is Mohammed Saluddin from SCAS, Thomas Kalona from SCAS. It's a non-profit organization working in Bangladesh since 1995. And SCAS has got unlisted fund forms state UK, and under the project we have launched many things, and among them one was the flexibility of the use of the funds and the reporting, and it also increased involvement of the frontline staff, created and increased organization visibility, and it is also created further funding opportunity for SCAS, and SCAS organization's capacity develop. SCAS has ability to make quick change without having to wait for donor approval, and so opportunity to contextualize. Due to its SCAS could reach actual beneficiary and easily avoid overlapping, and it also benefiters easily would make the decisions based on beneficiary feedback, and we also able to hire qualified human resource as per needs to implement the project. And we also use this fund for our other projects and project activities. And here I can make some recommendations for INGO and state donor agencies to increase the amounts of fund and fund for the long-term projects, and the organizations can set their own time, encourage local organizations to spend for their capacity development. Thank you for giving support.
Okay, so here was basically the recordings from SQS side, and if you say to share some of my opinions, so I would say that SQS has done a tremendous job. They have developed a child rates module using this fund, which has been now using in the Rohingya level, Rohingya camp level, with the Rohingya children and beneficiary level, and some other new donors has now been interested to use this area and how they can develop more, like if I say the adolescents rights module and some other rights bit module. So yeah, they developed this child rights module using this unrestricted grant. And also another thing is that they supported a lot of people, like to provide food items in the time of COVID-19. You know, that time there's a very much difficulties ongoing in the Rohingya camp level, so they supported a lot of things in this area. So yeah, this unrestricted fund make them so much flexible, and also they can like they develop a child rights module, which is now being used, and also it also emphasizes how they can also ensure their participation in future area as well. So yeah, over to you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Imtiaz and SKUS as well for those reflections, and great to hear again that this this opportunity has led to further funding opportunities as well. Just a reminder, please keep your questions coming into the chat for Evelyn or SKUS or for us. Save or Street Child. We'll try and get to those questions at the end of the webinar. So I'll now try to hand over to Hamdi in Afghanistan. Hamdi, can you hear me? And have you managed to get a recording from the partner who participated there, the coordination of rehabilitation and development services for Afghanistan? Hamdi, if you can hear me, over to you.
Loud and clear.
Good.
Thanks, Sarah. And hello, everyone. I'm Hamidullah Abbawi, the country representative for Street Child in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, my colleagues from CRDSA could not make it into the call, but I do have a WhatsApp recording from him, which I'll play shortly.
Good evening. This is Omid, the program manager from CRDSA Afghanistan. And thank you for giving me the time to present what we have learned from our child protection related projects so far. The things I would like to raise now is the lesson we have learned from all our child protection intervention in Afghanistan. And I want to share with friends. The first one is the complex child protection issues, which requires a multi-sectoral approach and joint solution to provide comprehensive system of support for highly vulnerable children. It means that we have found that children and their families, they have sometimes they have a complex and they have holistic needs, which require a multi-sectoral intervention and assistance. So it means there needs to be a very close coordination between the humanitarian actors for providing the same services in the field. And the second thing is very important, the participation and consultation with the people that we serve, because what is important, we need to be in close consultation and coordination with the community that we serve in terms of identifying the needs and the gaps, and also to understand the context and the needs of the children, and based on that we design our intervention and we design our service to need the children. This is the second thing is very important. The participation of the community should be very meaningful, meaning that the community should be engaged in the designing of the intervention and the need assessment approach, and also all decision makings, and they need to know who we are and how we provide them with our services. So just to have a better effectiveness of our intervention in the field.
I hope everyone could hear that. But overall, there's a lot of my colleague from CRDSA, Yahya Omid, mentioned some key points as coordination, engagement with the community, needs analysis. In terms of the context of Afghanistan, this is very well done by a local partners have access to very hard to reach areas, and this gives us the ground to reach and engage with the NSAGs as well through our local partners. We have had good experience in implementing almost impossible projects within the most hard to reach areas. So keeping in mind our localization project, the grand bargain commitments, I highly encourage and request donors to always consider local partner engagement in any sort of funding that they provide, and be flexible on that. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamdi, and thank you to Yahya Omid as well for those reflections. and also that call for more participation of local organisations in any donor conversation or engagement. So thank you. And Ben, I don't know if I can hand over to you next. If we've managed to get a recording from Hallmark Leadership Initiative from Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And again, we have a contribution from Mohammed, the leader of the Hallmark Initiative in Nigeria, the organisation who we worked with there. And again, really echoes some of the points that were made by Evelyn around, ability to respond to emergencies. And I'll just play the clip now.
Ahmed Kabir, and I stand in as the program manager for Hallmark Leadership Initiative in Nigeria. I would like to respond via this voice note to the two technical questions. I think for me, the most interesting thing that I've learned from this project is that this project has really taught us that we can actually do more with very little resources, especially when it is at our dispensation. When these resources are readily available, and in terms of emergency, we can depict when and how to use those resources. I think that is a very key learning for us, and for me in particular, from this project. It's also about having funds that are flexible, funds you can actually work with the people you serve, and to decide how and when it should be utilized. So actually, the unrestricted nature of this fund has availed us the opportunity to respond to emergency at its peak. That is at the immediate occurrence of the emergency. For example, we were able to respond to the pandemic at when it is due, which is, if we look at other sources of funding that are available for us, reverse is the case, because we have to follow other procedures before, and the funds are mostly restricted to specific activities. But in this case, the unrestricted nature of this fund has allowed us to actually navigate and re-strategize and again prioritize our activities. So this has further shown us a new way of doing things and has served as a door to other opportunities. So I think these are the 2 or 3 key learnings from.
So yeah, they were the few key learnings from Mohammed from Hallmark, which is really useful. And just to add to that slightly, what they were able to do within the first few weeks of the school closures in Nigeria was to set up a radio education show for adolescent girls with radios in their houses within 2 weeks of the school closures in Nigeria, where other NNGOs took up to a month, if not longer, to respond in a similar way, which was an amazing achievement, and just shows that once the decision-making power is with local actors and they can respond quickly without bureaucracy, they're able to make informed decisions based on the community's needs, which was really impactful.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you so much for relaying Mohammed Kabir's message from Hallmark Leadership Initiative. As I mentioned, please keep adding your questions to the chat for all of our participating organisations. And Ben, I'll hand back to you actually for a quick summary of those key findings and recommendations so that we can build on those and move into the Q&A session. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Sarah. And I'll try and keep this as quick as possible because I do want to leave some time at the end for questions from the audience, because I know there's some questions coming in and I want to leave that space. So quickly, after the project, across the 3 months when we finished, there was a 95% expenditure rate of the funding, which meant that the majority of the funds were spent. That 5% that was remaining, we allowed local organisations to have the flexibility of spending it whenever they wanted. So it was left with the organisation to decide how they would spend that in the future, giving them the flexibility. There was no requirement to send any funding back. So that was a level of trust and authority that was we received a lot of good feedback from on that. And out of that 95% expenditure, there was 10% of the total budget that was spent on core costs. So by that we mean costs that are central to the organisation and are not related to activities with communities in the field. And therefore, as a result, 85% of the budget on average across the 6 organisations was spent on traditional project-related activities, which I think was a very interesting conclusion and findings. And there's a lot of things to unpack there about why that happened. I think going into this project, we thought that there might be a higher percentage of the unrestricted funds that might be spent on core costs. And some of the factors that fed into this, we had interviews, as I said, with all 6 organisations as soon as the project finished to understand why they made these decisions. And we narrowed down these findings on key decision making into 3 key categories. So what inspired spending in certain ways? Organisations mentioned external factors, and this came because the funding came in March. They had March for 3 months to spend it, and this was at the outbreak of COVID in many of these countries. So external factors such as the rapid onset of emergencies such as COVID-19, it gives them the flexibility to respond to these emergencies as and when they happen. And also based on the community's needs, not just emergency onset needs, but also historic needs. Local organisations are often embedded in communities and they know the ongoing needs of the communities they serve. However, with traditional funding mechanisms, you have to look at the donors' priorities and the donors' objectives, and often you can't fit the needs of the communities into those objectives. So it gave, the ability to make those decisions. Also, who makes the announcement of the call for proposal? We decided to work through the education cluster, and the education coordinators in each country announced these calls. We then realised that as a result of that, many of the organisations spent it on education-related activities. And yes, it's the fact that these organisations were also education activities, but they had the option to spend it any way they wanted to. So some of the feedback was that because it was announced by Street Child, because it was funded by Save the Children and Danida, and because it was announced by the education coordinators, these external factors started to influence the way it was spent. And we'll come more into that in conditional factors. Additionally, there's some internal factors that were reported back that influence spending, the size and the decision-making process of an organisation. So is it one person making decision, or is there a process flow that works through the funding? That also influenced the way money was spent. And also the financial health of the organisation. Depending on the size of the organisation and its financial health, that might influence the way that it was spent on salaries, or how the split between core costs and project costs were positioned. And finally, as I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, conditioning factors. And this is really based on kind of the historic relationships between donors and local actors in these contexts, because there's been a historical, especially with protracted crises, there is a history behind the way that local organisations have been seen to be expected to spend their money. And therefore, organisations even reported when given 100% complete freedom, they still felt the pressure to spend it in a certain way, which I think is incredibly revealing about the way that humanitarian aid is structured in a lot of these contexts, and how we need to break down some of those barriers that set up this system to make organisations think they should spend funding in a certain way, even when given the freedom. So I think if we want to move on to the next slide, please, Sarah. And then the final kind of objective of this project was to kind of make recommendations and share learnings. And this is what this webinar is doing today. And some of the key things we wanted to break down to you guys today was, recommendations for donors and grant makers in general, but also suggested other future pilots that could be used to further explore this research and this knowledge gap. And we really feel like this is a knowledge gap going forward. So for donors and grant makers, unrestricted funding for local actors allows them to make informed decision making based on the community's needs, and they know it the best because they are there in the communities, and they can react And they can also react quickly to rapid onset of emergencies and respond quicker than we can as INGOs. Also, it's about trust as well. Donors already give INGOs 7% plus often of unrestricted funding, but we do not, as INGOs, historically do the same to local actors. So why is this not more common? And we should be trying to use unrestricted funding as a trust by giving it down to local organisations as well. Also, when an organisation hasn't spent all the money in time, don't rush them to spend it or give it back. Work with them like we do often with bigger agencies to work through no-cost extensions and ways to make that funding be spent in better ways. And then finally, training alongside, giving of unrestricted funding and funding in general, how to generate your own funding as well. 2 organisations through this project actually showed their pilot that they did in response to COVID with this $15,000 as a tiny project. They were actually able to get further funding and get bigger funding from donors through showing this project pilot they were able to do. And then finally, other research projects in the future. It'd be great to see the impact of unrestricted funding on smaller organisations. So removing the budget cap that we had before to allow smaller organisations in, and helping them if they have financial systems that can't cope with $15,000. Help them set up something that can work for them. Fit for purpose. Also flexible funding, where the partner can give them the amount of funding they need and the time they need. That allows them to make more informed decision. Also neutralize the fund manager. So don't have it as a education actor giving funding or a certain agency. Try and do intersectorial to avoid biases in the way that it's funding. So these are some of the key things that we think are worth thinking about when giving unrestricted funding from donors, but also other further projects and pilots that could be used to really further push this knowledge and research in the future.
Thanks so much, Ben. And just looking at the most frequently asked questions in the Q&A section, I hope a lot of those will have been answered through the recommendations here on the slide. But one, as we move on now, just with a few minutes left to be able to address the questions. One of the questions that keep popping up is around this accountability and transparency piece, and the management of resources involved in the project. So I wonder whether, Ben, you could elaborate a little on how that challenge was overcome with this project specifically.
So sorry, say again, the challenges of?
Sorry, accountability and transparency of funds, use of funds.
Sure. So we, in terms of transparency of funding, we wanted it also to be based on trust as well. So we wanted a due diligence process that was fit for purpose. So we, in the application process, organisations would share their bank account details, and we would check with the bank that they were a registered organisation with them. But in terms of the due diligence, it was quite small scale. We wanted to check that they were a registered organisation, had a working bank account that was related to their organisation, and also they were a education actor. But beyond that, we wanted to try to keep it quite small. At the first stage with the budget setting, we asked them for an indicative budget, how they wish to spend the funding. Then at the end of the project, we asked them to provide how they actually spent the funding. So, I mean, in theory, there was no real way that an organisation could not spend this in a way that worked for them, because it was 100% unrestricted funding. So we really just wanted an open and honest process that allowed them to really kind of give their honest way that they spent their funding, and so therefore we learned from this process. So we try to break down some of those barriers to transparency that have maybe been there in the past when there's dynamics of a funder and an implementer.
Thank you so much, Ben. And as is always the way, it seems in these calls, we have run out of time, but just wanted to finish with a thank you, and making sure that we were able to finish with a thank you to all the participating organisations that were able to join the call today. Again, apologies for some of the technical difficulties, but again, that is the nature of our work and what we're all a part of. So we hope this webinar has provided you with food for thought, for the use of wider unrestricted funding, and will hopefully spark many more research projects in this area to build on the findings and recommendations of this research and really begin to increase the evidence base in this area and in this way of working. If anyone on the call would like further information on the study, or if you have any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself or to Ben, and hopefully you'll eventually be able to see the contact details on this slide. As I mentioned at the start, a recording of this event will be available via the original event link, so please do share that with your network. There are also in the next few weeks going to be copies of the research report available in 6 additional languages. There will be translated versions in French, Portuguese, Bengali, Pashto, Dari and Hausa. So please do reach out if you would like access to any of those translated versions. And again, thank you to everyone who joined. It was a fantastic level of engagement throughout. We had over 200 attendees at one stage. So thank you so much. And please do take this opportunity to build. Yes, please, Ben, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to say, for all of those that are kind of interested in seeing a bit more of this information firsthand and digesting it, the English version of the report is currently live on the Street Child website. So feel free to go over to that and get some inspiration and understand a bit more the detail on that now, if you please.
Thank you so much for joining. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye bye everyone.